Assalamu alaikum ji. I am Iftikhar Ahmed, Assistant Professor at PIDE. On the behalf of Dr. Nadeemul Haq, Vice Chancellor PIDE, I welcome you all to today's hybrid seminar on Islamabad's urban and architectural genesis. Today we are lucky to have Ms. Saboohi Sarshar. She is Principal Architect and CEO at AGA Design Solutions, and she will be talking about the topic, which is definitely very important. So we are looking forward to learn from you and forward the discussion that PIDE had generated since 2006. So looking forward to you, and the floor is yours. You will have 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor.
There were a lot of new nation states that were founded after World War II, one of them being Pakistan. You can see them highlighted in red. There were around 80 or so nation states that formed after the break of the hegemony of the empires. And these were the nation states that were formed after the breakup of the British Empire. Present-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh also being one of them. Pakistan similarly was composed of East and West Pakistan and came into being in 1947. And Islamabad was a city envisaged for this new country, taken after a year after General Ayub's military takeover in 1960, where the reversion of a political system from governmentality to sovereignty provided ample opportunity to employ power as a tool for its establishment, as was the case in all of the other states as well. So power and identity are two main themes that are in this book. The dual themes form the framework for the analysis of this research. The signifying aspect of space is interrelated with these as they hone the socio-cultural context. The socio-cultural context, which is everyday lived experience, has a direct bearing on representation of spatiality. And we cannot take our eyes away from the fact that spatiality is everyday lived experience, and it's the expression that concretizes who we are. And this representation of spatiality is done by architectural and planning aesthetics, and the representational forms are the architectural and urban forms. In this context, Michel Foucault is a very eminent philosopher, and in his view, the modern form of power is not a coercive or a commanding instruction, as it was in the days before the formation of Pakistan and the other nation states. It's a coercive ability which institutionalizes itself and then comes forth into the representational forms and takes advantage of the everyday lived experience. And the second philosopher that I really took inspiration from was Henry Lefebvre. And he says that this power affects the conception of space, and it breeds new way of looking at the self in relation to the whole and a new manner in which to experience reality. And the external structures produced by power in the spatial realm, representation and meaning play an integral part in this understanding. Hence, the potency of the lens of Lefebvre's spatial ideology as an outcome of political ideology through the interstice of spatial practice and representation and representational space holds a lot of sway. This is Doxiadis, who was called in to put the expression of a focused statehood into concrete form. And he was an imported technical professional, as were the other architects on which this particular research and book focuses for the urban planning and design of the architecture of the new nation state. And this import brought with it an inculcation of modernism into the intellectual vacuum that was the new nation state of Pakistan. This is an aerial photograph of Islamabad. And in order to understand Islamabad's genesis, it is important to understand the varied concerns before Islamabad came into being. And a prerequisite is to understand the events that enabled its formation and to study why it was formed the way it was formed. Similarly, regarding the architectural attributes of its capital complex on which this book focuses, it is vital to place Islamabad in the global context of architectural aesthetic that was going on at that time, particularly the 1960s, without divorcing it from its colonial legacy, which we were carrying on after the partition. And this is a picture showing Doxiadis with Sir Robert Matthew from UK and Marcel Breuer from USA, along with Zahiruddin Khwaja, who was appointed from the CDA to be a host and also a coordinator for these architects, inspecting the capital site, which goes to show that obviously in Pakistan, we had an intellectual vacuum that needed to be filled. We had a lack of expertise, and therefore the idea to call in experts from outside, which was also emblematic of a colonial legacy that was already going on, in which reliance on imported ideas was more so than reliance on local ideas. So the architectural and urban genesis of Islamabad focuses on the formation of Islamabad and its capital complex. The first part being the urban form of Islamabad, and the second part being the representational institutional buildings, which came to represent Islamabad and Pakistan. And it is very evident that whenever you go to a different country and you see their banknotes, architecture forms part of the identity. It is always at the back, along with an iconic hero or a person who is representative of the power of that particular state or country. These are the archives that I consulted to bring forth documentation and letters and plans and other material that helped me to understand how we established a style for the architecture of the capital complex. So the first part is affairs of the mind, state, and capital in relation to power, and how it bred the city that we see today. So, as in all ancient times, all institutional buildings of power were always at a certain height so that they were significant, therefore signifying their importance by their spatial representation. And this is where the origin of the word capital also comes in, from the word capitalis, which is the head. The word capital with O is often confused with the term, but it has a shared etymology. It comes from the name of the Capitoline Hill in Rome, where the Roman Senate convened in the Capitolium. It is from this physical and linguistic grounding that we've defined the capital and the capital today in the English language. This is similar. In a similar vein, castles were also built on heights. Coming to the urban form, an example is the law of the Indies, which resulted in specific tailoring of the city and its architecture. So this was written by the Spanish authorities for a handbook to establish their new colonies. So in Foucault's term, sovereign power operates by absolute rule of law, as I'd already stated. It is largely a traditional form of governance and involves absolute obedience to a monarch or a central authority, whereas disciplinary power gradually manifests itself in tension with sovereign power. And this happened in the 18th and 19th century. Disciplinary power confirms itself in the physical effect of control and its appearance through surveillance and force. This is achieved by a regulation of space, time, and behavior, which is imposed through a complex interconnection of institutions within society. In this manner, power reaches into the very grain of individuals, touches their bodies, and inserts itself into their actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes, and everyday life, which is the case with Islamabad. But one of the historical perspectives that one can relate to is the design of Paris by Baron Haussmann, which happened right after the French Revolution, which sought to not have revolutionaries ease of use of the public space, and therefore it would restrict their movement. Boulevards were widened, facades were unified, so that there was surveillance that could be easily done in the time of the French rule. All right. And obviously, all capitals are built on ideology. And according to Lefebvre, what we call ideology only achieves consistency by intervening in social space and its production, and thus by taking on a body therein. When this ideology or naturality intervenes in social space, it produces a focus space, embodying a hierarchy of centers and a main center, i.e. the national capital. So this is Edward Lutyen's New Delhi, which was a British Raj design. And in this also, as you can see, there is a main avenue which is leading to the institutional building, therefore signifying its authority and sovereignty. And the New Delhi was transformed for the visit of the monarch for centenary celebrations of the Queen at that particular time. This is New Delhi and Old Delhi. As you can see, the old city and the new city are in high contrast. You can see a regimentality that is sort of coming in with a geometricality in the urban design, which seeks to control different pockets of the urban environment. Therefore, by dividing them into hierarchical pockets, which can then be standardized and also easier to rule. Similar is the case with the organic city of Rawalpindi and the cantonment, which is then also more regimental, as you can see, in terms of its byways and leeways and where people are settled according to their social and economic classes. So initially, the idea was to establish a new capital, but the new capital was first supposed to be in Karachi. But when Ayub Khan came in as a sovereign or military dictator is when the idea of establishing a new capital was taken. But initially, there was the idea of establishing satellite towns in the country to accommodate the migrants that were coming in. This martial law proclamation is displayed here because it gives absolute authority to the sovereign to take decisions for the people of the country. This is Ayub's speech in 1960, and I will read it out to you. He says, and as all leaders and dictators have always wanted to establish capitals say, Islamabad has been my dream always, and it is not a dream which is unrealistic or unwanted. Whether the capital was to be in Karachi or elsewhere, it would have had to be built. Let me tell you this, the capital of a country is the focus and center of people's ambitions and desires, and it is wrong to put them in an existing city. It must have a color of its own and a character of its own. And that character is the sum total of the aspirations, the life and ambitions of the people of the whole of Pakistan. And therefore, you can see from his speech that he also wanted Islamabad to be emblematic. And it is also particularly interesting that in that time, there were a lot of new capitals coming up, and we have an established rivalry with India. We had just parted with them. And they had imported an architect to make Chandigarh, which was receiving a lot of attention. So Ayub Khan gathered a group of people and sent them to Chandigarh to understand what was it about about the capital of Punjab that was garnering so much importance. And therefore, that is when he decided that Islamabad would be a new city based on, and the name is also emblematic of the identity that he wanted to portray. Islamabad. The first factor behind Pakistan's bolster state was a decolonization, obviously, but it was also funded by different organizations in tune with a capitalist democratic agenda. The city formed the vehicle for its change, and it is very important to note that Doxiadis was backed by the Ford Foundation's economic interests. In tandem, Pakistan's first 5-year plan, drafted in 1954, included many new settlements. And because it was backed by the Ford Foundation, you will see that in the urban plan, it is very evident that the city is built for not pedestrians, but for the usage of cars. Doxiadis was chosen on account of his appropriate work sensibilities as the chief consultant of Islamabad. During the construction of the capital, its representational attributes to the global community surpassed many other concerns of design. And it is also important to note that the Soviet Union was also offering aid in terms of technical expertise to Pakistan. And newspapers document that, but we were rejecting that because we wanted to tune ourselves with a capitalist democratic agenda. So this political theater of development helped in further establishing the capital politically as a symbol of development and social transformation, modernization, and state building, which was to be put in practice in case of other settlements as well. So this is East and West Pakistan. The second relation after the notion of development was a hearkening to a religious sentiment by the regime. And this was a unifying element for the population of discordant geographical and ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Following the World War, the British decided to grant self-rule to the Rain. In British India, Muslims were outnumbered by Hindus 3-1. Their mistreatment at the hands of the majority led Muhammad Ali Jinnah to demand regional autonomy in Muslim majority areas. When these negotiations failed, a demand was made for an independent nation state for the Muslims of India, composed of a diverse group of regions and cultural backgrounds. So Pakistan knew inhabitants had only religion as their common denominator, and this the regime wanted to use to its advantage as a unifying tool. So let's go over how the site and name was selected. Then we'll talk about Doxiadis in Islamabad. And then we look at, in terms of aesthetics and in terms of visuals, the basic layout, the acoustical grid in the unit, and the administration along an axis and the capital complex location. So these are suggestions of the Federal Capital Commission Committee for a capital site, and you can see there are various sites that are earmarked according to different concerns. So according to town planning and aesthetic factors, according to civil supplies factors, according to communications, development, internal relations, geographical and financial factors, and different committees were formed. And you can see the importance that these committees gave to different sites. And Islamabad was not one of the prime locations that these subcommittees had earmarked. Fort Monroe was a more favored site, as the archival records show, but a supreme decision was taken by the then dictator Ayub Khan. And in no way am I saying it was a good or bad decision, but it was an overriding decision that was taken because there was a proximity to the Rawalpindi cantonment, which was one of the major places where the army was at that point. And certain reports show, and documents also show, that this was one of the prime reasons, and also that it was in proximity to where his rural ancestral background was. One of the reasons that Doxiadis wanted Islamabad was that it was on the Asian highway in Islamabad, and his theory of acoustics wanted major transportation routes to be placed along major cities, which would form a superhighway, just like the Silk Road in the olden times. Obviously, he was not taking into consideration future political factors. But at that time, this was the Great Asian Highway that he wanted. As I mentioned, it was the important regional headquarters for the Pakistan Army, which was of great significance to Ayub Khan. And this desire for a particular spatial manifestation is found subservient to power and identity concerns. So left to right, you can see Sir Robert Matthew, who was brought in to be in charge of the capital complex architecture, Orestes Yakas and General Ayub Khan with Doxiadis discussing the master plan of Islamabad. According to Doxiadis' theory, he wanted the city to be a center which would then expand, and the expansion of the center would be according to the movement of Rawalpindi and Islamabad, and he came up with a grid-like formation for both these cities. But you can see that the expansion of the city is curtailed by the formation of the Margala Hills on one side. So it was to be in one direction, unidirectional. This is from Doxiadis' reports, and you can see that at the behest of also the government and his own idea, he wanted to give segments for different incomes. In the organic city, you do not see that. In the organic city, organically and socially, different classes interact with the other classes. But here, the low, middle, and high incomes were segregated. And this you can see evident if you are a person who lives in Islamabad. So this is a sector. He decided the sector to be 2.2 kilometers by 2.2 kilometers, which is different from Chandigarh's sector, which is more pedestrian friendly. It is rectangular, whereas we have a more square formation. There was standardized low and high income houses based on the modern tropes of lack of ornamentation. And the new dynamic Islamic city was very exclusive of Rawalpindi and was almost parasitic to the old city, even though it was its neighbor. So this was the grid that he had envisaged around Rawalpindi. And we know that this has not been followed. It is very interesting to note, and you can see from here, that he wanted the institutional building to be at the capital or at the head. And you can see these vision lines that he's drawn in the section, so that if you are approaching along this route, you will be able to see that. And it is very interesting again to note, the presidential palace, as it was called, initially was placed at the right at the center of the axis, but then later removed to one of the sides. The presidential palace was to be housing the president at that time. These are drawings. That is the presidential palace. Another important thing to note was right at the crux of the axis, we would have a mosque or a ground in which people could gather, which is now the D chalk. Again, it was then segmentized and regimentalized, and the decision was taken to not have that because it was very near the center of power. And you can see a pedestrian esplanade was also a multi-level pedestrian esplanade was also envisaged on the greater Constitutional Avenue. So now we're going to talk about the architecture of the Capitol complex. It was very hard to define an appropriate architectural style, and then also to envisage how the Capitol complex would look like, because these were one of the first buildings to be built in Pakistan, which were state sponsored. And it was very hard to disassociate or distance ourselves from the legacy that we were carrying on. Two legacies. One was the post-colonial legacy, so the impact the British had because we were ruled over by them for multiple centuries, and then a hearkening to associate ourselves with the Muslim splendor of the past. So there were two diverse and really disconnected hierarchies that we were battling or dealing with. And there was almost a magnetic attraction towards Mughal architecture that we had because we wanted to identify with being Muslims, but it was a very, not ingrained in our social structure sort of hearkening, but more cosmetic hearkening that we wanted to see reflected in our Capitol building forms. So this is a meeting of the CDA board with foreign architects that were invited. So Robert Ponti and Rosselli from Italy, Arnie Jacobson from Scandinavia, and Louis Khan, who was from USA. And these are all now architects, as in our profession we call them, and they are people that we study as precedents, but Islamabad's people that we rejected their proposal because they were not Islamic enough. And then we decided on E.D. Stone to design our buildings. So meeting of world-renowned architects with CDA top officials reviewing the plans and the progress of Islamabad. When initially Doxiadis has come in, he was not very happy with how the Mughals were also very sovereign in their representation, and it was one person centric, the architecture as well as all the development that they did. But then after the CDA sat him down, he was forced to look at Mughal architecture in a more in a very different light and try to draw inspiration from it. But it felt like that inspiration that he drew was almost sort of regimented on him instead of being organic. This is a photograph by Doxiadis of the Shahi Mosque, and because he also notes in his diary, it is in a relatively poorer indigenous vicinity. So it doesn't reflect architecture that is primarily for the people, but only for the sovereigns. This is one of the first plans by Hearst, Randall, and Batten, but this is a proposal for Karachi in 1952. And here you can see also Islamic forms that are being used. This is an urban square, and this was to lead to the Qaid's mausoleum. And this would have been the capital with administrative buildings lined to the sides. As you can see, it also uses a very rectilinear, unilateral approach towards the Capitol complex in the 3D and the other picture. But we had a dichotomy again, because in Pakistan, we didn't have the resources that the West had. The West had gone through a profound transformation after World War in terms of modernization. They had construction materials and technologies that they could use to their advantage. And they were constructing mass housing also for the people that had been displaced after the World War. In Pakistan, we had a very different context. Even though we were importing that technical expertise, we didn't have the infrastructure to support the technical expertise that we were importing. So we were still relying very much on manual labor and non-mechanized systems for development and construction. So when we had imported these people, it was very hard for them to understand the social context. And therefore, their designs also were not very conducive to the environment that we were in. This is just a comparison between areas in 1964, the amount of residential area as opposed to allotted to the people as opposed to allotted to the laborers. So the laborers had to live in very difficult conditions at that point as well. And therefore, construction was not as speedy as it would have been required to be. This is a table that compares the area allocated in the first 4 years of Islamabad's development. So residential area for government personnel took the precedence over government offices, commercial areas, or area for labor and displaced person. Again, a very top-down approach as opposed to a bottom-up approach. This is the first building that was erected. This is the Secretariat building by Gio Ponti and Albert Rosselli, and you can see it at the backdrop of the Margala Hills. But as soon as this building was built, there was a lot of backlash of sentiment from the people because they thought that it did not emblematically reflect Islamic designs. And therefore, a committee was formed under the chairmanship of N.A. Farooqi, and there was a detailed deliberation as to what Islamic architecture should be. And there was a series of conferences held both in East and West Pakistan. And they came to decide that Mughal architecture's arches and domes were the most significant element that could represent Islamic architecture, whereas people who were coming in from outside had a very different, more, let's say, not cosmetic view of Islamic architecture. They would study the building plans and want to inculcate the idea of gardens, open spaces, natural ventilation, and functionality more than just a dome. And I don't know if it is a good or bad thing that because we had run out of funds, our buildings do not have a dome, even though they had that in the initial designs, as you will see further. So this is a proposed elevation of the Parliament building by Arnie Jacobson. And at that time, he was patenting aluminum facade panels, which we see now in our modern building forms. But they thought that his technology was a little too expensive for our needs, and therefore it was rejected, even though Arnie Jacobson is known as one of the pioneers of modern architecture, hailing from Scandinavia. These are his plans, plan and section of the Parliament building. As you can see, he also had a dome, but it was a very inverted dome in a cylindrical building, as opposed to a very prominent one. This is Louis Kahn's proposal, in which he has done a clay model. He has a lake with, and this is just the presidential palace, which he has, and he used geometric forms. Because in West Pakistan, the sentiment for Muslim representation was more, Ayub Khan then transferred him to East Pakistan to then make their National Assembly building, which is something that tourists flock to and see because of its quality of architecture. Sad that we lost the opportunity to have him construct a building in Islamabad. So the Council of Islamic Ideology was also proposed to be right next to the presidential palace and the assembly building, but then it was later removed. There is a letter from N.A. Farooqi to Louis Khan, and you can read that in the book, in which he is asserting on the fact that there should be a dome. So Louis Khan is irked by it, and in correspondence to Sir Robert Matthew, and he says, it is very irksome that they are telling me to put a dome. However, I will try to use that in one of the buildings, and this is one of the buildings that he tried to use the dome, but in a very modernistic way and not in a traditional way. But this is what we decided on. So we decided on a very commercial sales pitch of Edward Durrell-Stone, who had done the American Embassy in New Delhi, and because he was covered on the Time magazine list, is why we invited him to do Pinstech first, and then gave him the commission for these buildings, rejecting all of the other architects, which architecturally, critically speaking, were doing more sensible buildings in terms of functionality and construction methodology. And this is the dome that sadly, or not sadly, ironically, did not get built due to lack of funds on the presidential secretariat. Later on, buildings also got inspired by the decisions that that committee took in the genesis of the architectural complex. Therefore, the Prime Minister's Secretariat, built in 2007 by NESPAC, also heralds back to a Mughal legacy of cosmetic arches and domes as opposed to more functional forms. And this somehow has come to represent our state ideology in architecture. And modern architecture with a capital M is something that we want to aspire to, but it doesn't intrinsically come to us. And therefore, we're still stuck in that dichotomy because we haven't come up with a synonymous style, which would we call, in terms of architecture, Pakistani or national, even though that's another debate altogether. These are, again, Fire Brigade headquarters in Islamabad by E.T. Stone. Supreme Court of Pakistan was designed by a Japanese architect, Kenzo Tange, and it stands out because he would not listen to the ideas of the committee. Sir Sayyid Memorial by Naqvi and Siddiqui Architects, again with a dome on top. But what the research wants to highlight is that even though we've come a long way from the 1960s, we're still stuck in that debate because we haven't gone through the transformation that the social transformation and the political transformation that the West has gone to, but we still want to adhere to their principles of architecture and construction and want to represent them in our everyday lived experience. But what is our everyday lived experience, and what are our actual social and economic concerns, which we completely lay to the side and do not consult when we are coming up with architecture? So I think it breeds it breeds the debate that we should look into as to who we are and what should our representational space be, what should our spatiality be, how politically it affects us in our everyday lived experience. And that's what this book wants to highlight on or start a debate on, and I hope that it will be helpful. So thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Saboohi, for such an insightful presentation, and definitely it's a very hard-earned book that you have made us familiar with. What I get from this is that sometimes lack of funds also help you, but not having domes everywhere. But they finally did it on the Parliament, on the PM House.
Yes.
I think they did it in so many number just to fulfill that wish. So I have just two questions. What I get from your book is that when the genesis was happening, so the more focus was on the look and feel of the capital or a city, not the livability, because you yourself have said about the walkability issue in the squares and stuff like that. So is there any discussion about that walkability and how the people would live, and what about the urban sprawl?
So Doxiadis has envisaged each sector as a sector in its own self. So if you see the community markets and the commercial areas, he wanted a sector to be self-sufficient, and he wanted different income groups in all the sectors, but he was made to change those because of the sovereign. So in his initial ideology, it was walkable and it was conducive to different social settings, but then it was changed.
Given the clusters, within the clusters.
With
right?
clusters within clusters, yes.
My second question is about the business model. Was there any business model assigned to this whole designing thing?
Not really. So the commercial area, or the commercial way in which the Constitution Avenue was supposed to grow in a linear direction because of the interconnection of it to the Grand Asian Highway. And Rawalpindi was also supposed to follow in its stead, because Rawalpindi's organic structure was also supposed to be gridlocked in a similar sector-like formation, and that it would grow outward, away from the Margala Hills. And but there was no business plan as such. They were just dispersed commercial areas. But the overall business plan was that it would be on a route which would then garner or lead to more commercial activity.
Right. So that's why we are having all the problems that we have today. My last question is that how the indigenous people's idea was incorporated within this whole scheme. Because normally we have, after the establishment of city, we have local governments or other stuff. But while it was happening. So was there any forum where the people's ideas were kept in?
No, there was not any forum particularly, but as I said, most of the focus was on how the buildings would look as and less so as to how they would behave. So there were conferences held for that, but not to how they would behave or what would the, uh, mm, requirement be for that particular thing. Yes.
All
I
right.
think so.
Thank you. Now I would open the floor, please.
Saboohi, thank you very much for a very nice, insightful, and very informative presentation. First of all, from where can we get the book?
PIDE is going to be launching it. So this
Oh,
is a pre-book
okay,
seminar.
excellent. So, when you talk about grid-like cities, New York comes to mind.
Yeah.
So, why is Islamabad so maligned for being a grid pattern city, and why New York is not? You talked about that segregation based on social status or
Right.
income was by design.
Yeah.
But that happens almost automatically everywhere in the world. I mean, automatically, if you go to New York, even within boroughs, you see pockets of affluence and very dismal state of affairs. So that is natural. Thirdly, it's a bit of a philosophical or questions. Uh, you said that capitals are mostly built at a height
Mhm.
just to show their grandeur and show the people
Mhm.
that who, I mean, means. But is it by design or is it an unconscious decision on part of I mean, if you talk about castles have to be at a elevation because they serve a different purpose. They are
Security concerns.
security concerns. So is it by design that all capitals, like you showed, capital Indian
Yes.
New Delhi,
Mhm.
that is also at a end of a very long road, and then
Mhm.
it's a bit elevated. So these are my questions.
All right. So the first one is that Islamabad is not maligned, but it is criticized, let's say, because it follows a grid like formation, but it doesn't do what other cities of the world do, which is that it is conducive to pedestrians, or that it allows for urban transportation, mass urban transportation modes, which allow for movability from one place to another. As I said, and if Islamabad had a more comprehensive, let's say, urban mobility plan, maybe I would not be saying that it is favored for the very few who have the means of mobility as opposed to those who don't. And metro buses also come about only in the recent years. So for the years from Islamabad inception to, let's say, the 2000s, that was not something that was happening. And therefore, that is why New York works, because it has a very robust public transportation system. And when you talk about pockets of affluence and pockets for the lack of, I think a city organically grows. You can't regimentalize it. But in the case of Islamabad, it was sort of regimentalized. Organic development happens. A sector right now is not contained in and of itself. You would want to go for a particular commercial activity to a sector which is 10 sectors away from where you are living, because that's just how it has grown to be. But the idea that you can just get up and go there easily, that is what makes it more successful, or excuse me, less successful. Another thing is that in New York, as you mentioned, there are places which have rent controlled housing, which leads to more affordability of people to be living in, let's say, a central location which is near to their work or to the center of the commercial activity. Yeah, this is a state, it is state run and it is state done and run. And therefore, those policies help in making a city more workable. Therefore, Islamabad is criticized because it lacks those other ingredients.
It's more of evolution than, it's not by design. It has not been allowed to evolve in the way that it should have.
Cities are engines of their own growth, right? And state and policies matter a lot. Economic policies, social policies, top-down approach matters a lot, whereas bottom-up, it is going to, evolve on its own. And that's what it is. And coming to your third concern, or question, which was that is it by design that places of importance are placed on a height? More so now than before. Before, maybe it was more strategic, as you said, because of defense purposes. A castle needed to be at a height, so you could look at people who were approaching for attack. But in later years, it was more processional. So in the case of New Delhi, the avenue is designed to be for the procession that when the king or the sovereign visits. And in Pakistan, in Islamabad, it's supposed to be at an angle where you can see the institutional building and be inspired by it, because it wants for it to be a symbol that you can look at or into.
Thank you, Saboohi, for your wonderful presentation. I have a few questions. The first is like how long it took to make the initial outlay to make the people livable in Islamabad, and what was the estimated cost to outlay the construction of Islamabad?
Right.
And the okay, I can ask the next question later.
Okay, so for the estimated cost, there is a book by Zamir Jaffer, who was a heading CD at that point, which outlines the first 10 years of Islamabad development and the cost that it took. So I can give you the reference for that. The first one, the plan kept changing. So Doxiadis would come to Pakistan for the first 5 years of development from 1954, and he would keep on visiting. And at first, he had envisaged satellite towns for all of the country, in which the people who were migrants would then be settled. So the decision for Islamabad came later, and he was hired as the planner. So he'd already gotten some, idea of what the country was like. And then it took 2 or 3 years for the initial development, and then because other factors and actors were involved, it then took more time. But the initial plan was done in 2 or 3 years.
At the initial time, because the idea behind the idea, there was no civilian authority, so there was a typical mindset, the dictators who want to establish a city, a capital for the country. So might be at that time, because the mindset was the power based on the power corridor and to protect the power corridor. So like the Chandigarh, the pedestrian, it wasn't pedestrian friendly. So it seemed like it was to protect the power corridor, but not to facilitate the citizens. But even after that, right now, the construction and the expansion of the Islamabad is in the same way. It's not even citizen friendly right now. So what's the reason behind that?
I would hearken it to policy and not following the plan. I don't know if we had followed the plan of the sector development as envisaged, and I'll show you the slide again, that it was just to be sectors and not the suburbia sprawl that we have, that it might have worked or might not have. It depends a lot on the state and its institutions as to how a city grows or it should be regulated. The urban planner or the architect can only do so much. As I said, it's representational of the ideology of what you want, but then it sort of fights with the fact that what the social values are and what the actual everyday lived experience is.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I would like to ask a question relating to the point where you ended your presentation about Muslim identity.
Right.
I mean, when you move in a city like Lahore, you move from inner city to the British era city and then the city after partition that was built.
Right.
You recognize the differences, no? Do you think that the Muslim identity question, which was, I mean, there are a lot of conferences, books on these question, what is an Islamic or Pakistani identity, Pakistaniyat? There is a lot of literature. Do you think that that question has been settled now in terms of architecture? And does it represent the whole of Pakistan from Sindh to Balochistan to Punjab and KP?
Thank you for. I will not answer that because it opens a Pandora's box. Identity is very, very, very tricky to define, especially in a case of a country like Pakistan. As I mentioned in my presentation, Islam is one binding factor that the state or the political ideology still adheres to. And that is something that they think that it sort of represents Pakistan, or they wanted to represent Pakistan, because a lack thereof, and you mentioned these different ethnicities and social backgrounds, for a lack thereof, it would be very hard to define what it is. And therefore, there is a want to stick to that one particular, identity, as opposed to all these diverse cultures that can be assimilated. And no, I don't think that that has been actually answered or can be easily done. It depends on the lens from which you look at it.
Okay, we have two questions online. Babar Mumtaz sir, please unmute and introduce yourself and have your question.
Hello. Yes, I've been fascinating to hear what you said, and particularly the way that you put your argument together. And one of the things that intrigues me is that right from the beginning, you never really raised the question of whether or not there is such a thing as an Islamic city. And I find this even more intriguing that in none of the arguments that the so-called experts presented, I mean, we're talking about Tange, we're talking, all the greats, not one of them raised this question. I mean, here we have a religion which is the first of those, let's say, the world religions, which is urban. Christianity was not an urban religion. Islam is the first and major urban religion. They built capitals, they built cities all over the world. And that these people came supposedly to draw up plans for a capital of the first Islamic or first modern Islamic country, and did not even ask themselves, or if they did, they leave no record of the fact that they might have wondered what would an Islamic city be like. Now, you've made some comparisons, and perhaps that is the closest that the committees came to between Islamabad and Chandigarh, for example. But Chandigarh's objective and status was extremely limited. It was an administrative center for a state. And even the Chandigarh that we see today, 2/3 of it is unplanned and largely squatters. So it was planned originally as a very small government center. It's unfair in that sense to begin to draw comparisons. However, to suggest that Pakistan chose a foreign architect because they were using one in Chandigarh is a bit, it's a kind of thin argument. But there is, of course, a counter argument, which almost sort of sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I would have liked to hear your views whether there is any truth in it. And that is, who is Doxiadis? I was a young student at the time, just started on my architectural career, and nobody had heard of Doxiadis. And suddenly he gets these commissions to build cities or parts of cities all over the newly emerging Islamic world, the capital of parts of Baghdad, in Iran, in Pakistan. And they are all funded by the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation is an extension of the CIA, or at least of US government policy. And the purpose of this is to produce a city that is not of the people, for the people. I mean, imagine talking about democracy to a man, so-called general, who destroyed democracy, set himself up, and then he says, this is a democratic, and not even question that. And then you produce this kind of city, and so you wonder why was, and if you read of some of the notes that Doxiadis wrote, it's quite clearly that the purpose essentially is to prevent an Islamic society from developing. It is to break up, not to afford opportunities for gatherings, not to afford local mosques and local markets to become the focus of attention, but to use the broad highways between these sectors to the equivalent, if you like, of Haussmann's clearing up of Paris. And I think I would really ask you to seriously look at some of these arguments from the point of view of your, if you like, your as a Pakistani. I don't know if you are or you are not, but not to come in just from the outside and sort of take for granted the fact that these people will. Just even you have not, at least I didn't hear you say whether or not there was a single Pakistani planner. Perhaps there was not. There was Zahiruddin Khwaja was a very competent architect. He didn't have, but then as I said, I mean, Doxiadis wasn't a planner either. Nor was Kenzetange, nor was any of these other people. They also learned their planning by doing Islamabad or by doing Chandigarh. I mean, Corbusier had theories of urban planning, but they were very different. And they, I mean, so I think that some more rigorous attention to those concerns is very necessary.
Thank you so much for your comments. So let me try to address them one by one. When you talk about the Islamic city, there is none that I've found in the archival documents or in the diaries or correspondences or in any of the books which talks about what an Islamic city should be. Rather, it was more only about the architectural style of that particular city, how should the houses look like or the institutional buildings should look like. And you're right that Islam is a religion that expanded, but what it did was that it took on regional semblances when it was trying to establish cities in different quarters of the world. But that is another debate altogether. The idea that it is a little thin, why were these people imported? Because it was for a lack of local expertise. Zahiruddin Khwaja is only one of the names that comes up when we talk about architects who were involved in the initial years of the development. But then even he was foreign trained, though he was somebody who was from Pakistan. And yes, we did have a lack of trained professionals, and that is why we imported all of the expertise that we did. And why we decided on Doxiadis and the conspiracy theory, I think Mr. Ahmed Zeeb Mahsood's PhD thesis would give a lot of light on that. And it is something that, it is a piece of academic research that I've read, and maybe it is true that Doxiadis was backed by the Ford Foundation as well as by the CIAM and the US, and therefore he got to design different cities in the world based on the idea of regimentality, but a very conducive regimentality that was supposed to be in the interest of the cars. And when we're talking about Ayub Khan, Ayub Khan had a very different mindset when it came to the city being the center of, let's say, activity. And while Islamabad was being planned, the famous Lahore riots took place, which was the massacre of a lot of Ahmadis, and which was one of the reasons that Ayub Khan transferred Louis Khan to West Pakistan to do their buildings, as opposed to keep him in East Pakistan, because he thought that an elevation of the Islamic ideology in concrete form would lead towards more unification and less towards more social or civil unrest when it came to the religious sentiment in this particular region. And I think that is one of the reasons that he also wanted to not have a pedestrian esplanade and not have a pedestrian or a gathering space for religious activity. And he made Doxiadis change the design. And the only precedence that Doxiadis looks towards when he talks about cities is not Islamic. He had his own ideology of acoustics and the human model and what should a city be in the modern times. And that is what he was following, as opposed to researching or looking at the traditional, I'm sorry, that sounds ironic also to say traditional Islamic city, but the local cities that he did look at, but he found them to be organic. And because he was planning something, he wanted it to be more regimental and geometrized or statistically driven, let's say.
Okay, now we will have the last question by Mr. Jamshed Khan.
Thank you so much. It was really a nice debate and discussion. And I have 4 questions and 4 points to discuss. First of all, there was a point, identity of Pakistan in one line. I think Pakistan, I would like to add something what I learned from my work and my experience. Pakistan identity is diversification. basically. Diversification, we need to understand the diversification in our culture, in our region, geographically, politically, and culturally. And every time when we sit for to approach the design, we need to understand the context in our on the basis of diversification. If we are going to design in a Sindh or we are going to design in KPK, we need to understand the context of the region and the culture. I think that is the point where we, as an architect, as a designer, we take the start of our project or our assignment. So in my opinion, we need to understand diversification of regional and cultural diversification all the time for every project. Islamic architecture is my second point. We need to actually, when we talk about on a bigger horizon, I think architecture is to give value to our values in a way. As an architect, we cannot design a building or spaces or places without understanding the values of the culture, and in the regional areas and aspect. So if we are going to design on the basis of our values, we automatically fall into on the point where we can easily design Islamic architecture or some else. It could be a Christianity, it could be other regional or religious aspects.
Sorry to interrupt. Jamshed, can you kindly keep it short?
Yeah, sure. One thing more I would like to add, that is also my questions. If you want to answer me, I can stop my questioning.
Okay, let's have another question, and then we will have both the questions answered together.
I think genesis of architecture, in my opinion, architecture is an ongoing process. We actually find different geographical and political shapes in the form of the countries, but we always need to understand the ongoing process of architecture from the cave to the high rises. So I think we cannot say there is a birth of the architecture. Actually, architecture is a climax on the basis of situation of society. We actually now, today we are talking about the climax of architecture, which based on the situation of society. And we have to talk about what was the situation when we were in the designing or in the planning of Islamabad, capital city. So we need to understand the situations. So we can understand the point where that process was actually exist or freezed that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamshed Saab. Now we have another question online. Let's take that as well, and then Saboohi will answer them together. Navida Makbul.
Okay, actually, I wanted to comment on this, Islamic part of the debate. Like you said, it's, I mean, when Islamabad, from the name, we mostly associate to Islam and Islamic. But otherwise, if we see the very rigid gridiron plan, and we compare it to the old, Islamic cities, like maybe the cities around the Balkans terrain in the Ottoman Empire. So Islamic was something based on values, not a planning, and it was mostly in the organic plannings with the cul-de-sacs and the inner courtyards. So the idea of privacy and, so that was actually the Islamic, if we want to establish a theory about the, you can say, morphogenesis of an Islamic city. So we have to take into account the Islamic values. But here in Islamabad, we don't see that emergence of, the city through values, but it is just a gridiron plan, probably inspired inspired by Chandigarh, by Le Corbusier, and just for the administrative purposes, just naming it Islamabad doesn't associate to Islamic, I think.
Since you mentioned Chandigarh, I remember Mr. Babar Mumtaz's comment also that maybe it's too shallow to compare Chandigarh to Islamabad. Probably is, but because of the kind of geographical vicinity that we have with India and the political situation that we had, it was something that was going on in Mr. Ayub Khan's mind, and therefore he sent people to go and look at it because it was garnering a lot of attention as a planned city, even though it was a small administrated capital of province. But when we talk about Islam as a noun, and when we talk about the city, it transforms into a verb. And there is the, again, dichotomy, because you can't really force the adjective that you would want on both of these things, which are very disjointed. And when you're talking about Ottoman cities or other historical cities, it was not maybe conscious, but it was everyday lived experience that bred those cities as they were. But here it was a conscious decision to have a gridiron plan, and not necessarily Islamic. And the book highlights that the word or the noun Islam is used as a surface treatment to have the adjective of Islam and try to instill, let's say, some sort of verb in everyday activities, according to the powers that be or people who were in charge of those decisions. And coming back, these were comments for Ms. Navida Makbul. And for Mr. Jamshed Khan, yes, I understand that maybe the term Genesis is sort of can be contested, but because it was a clean state on which Islamabad was being built is why the term Genesis was taken, because the root of the idea of architecture in Islamabad and its representation for the country was taking place. So that would be my answers.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. It's definitely an eye-opener for me, at least, and definitely others as well. It will definitely take the debate that PIDE started way back ahead. And with people like Jamshed Saab and Babu Mumtaz Saab, I'm definitely looking that more books are coming on the topic. So that's what PIDE is looking for, to generate the debate and keep it rolling. With this, I'll conclude this session. Thank you, Saboohi, and thank you, participants. See you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.